Well, I think that there were a few surprises because nobody expected Zelensky to do quite as well as he did. Nobody expected Tymoshenko to do relatively poorly. And of course, there were expectations that Hrytsenko, given that he was representing a coalition of democratic leaders, forces, that he would do better. And of course, another surprise, fourthly, that Smeshko, the former SBU leader, had as many votes or as much backing, roughly, as Hrytsenko himself. So I think there was no surprise that there's a great deal of dissatisfaction, that there is a massive protest vote against Poroshenko himself. I mean, he barely polled, what, 16, 17%, as we recall. But what has really been astounding is that since then, in the latest two polls, one last week, one today, he has shot ahead now by 47%, if we're to believe the very latest poll. That is incredible. I mean, that's almost unheard of in modern Ukrainian history of at least the independent Ukrainian state. So it reflects, as we've just said, a massive protest vote, which is also a massive expression of, shall we say, disbelief in, lack of confidence in Poroshenko, despite whatever achievements he can claim to have made. I would say that the clear signal is from the electorate is they want change. They want change even without knowing precisely what Zelensky is offering them in terms of the specifics of his program. I think we have to be very careful about how we approach the electorate now. If it was a question of 20% or 10% or 30%, we could say, well, as for example, the renowned Ukrainian writer Zabushko is saying that these are people that have been brainwashed. They're brainwashed by Moscow's influence, the oligarchs controlling the media. I heard her speak here last Friday at the Kiev Security Conference, but I think that's a non-starter. Yes, there are people who are uneducated, there are people who are not in the know, there are people who simply want to believe what they want to believe. But now, where we're talking at let's say, three-quarters of those who say they are going to vote say they will vote for Zelensky, we can't simply simplify it and say these people, are irresponsible voters. I think most of them are saying we are prepared to vote for the unknown rather than to accept more of the same. Which, which is, if I was in Poroshenko's shoes, I would heed that call because this is not about patriotism anymore. This is clearly that the image is wrong. The image is connected with failure to deliver on the ideals and promises of the Maidan and the Revolution of Dignity. Voters know that he had 5 years to deliver. And the other thing I want to emphasize, look, let's get away from these, I think, very false notions that Zelensky is about serving Kolomoisky. He's a stooge of Moscow, etc. These are cheap shots. We could have suspected that 3 or 4 weeks ago. But as he, or rather his advisors, have begun clarifying his position, and as his appeal grows even stronger, I think it's not on to simply dismiss it all as some kind of dark plot from Moscow to take control over Ukraine. The man is clearly a great surprise to all of us. He's an outsider. He's an actor. But he is a very skilled individual who's made a fortune through his TV shows. He's been linked to Kolomoisky, and we're not exactly sure the extent to which that link remains. But I think the bottom line is that he probably was lured into politics after doing his show to be a joker in the pack, to take away votes from others and maybe destabilize, disrupt the whole process, not in the sense of preventing the elections, but in terms of taking away votes from whether Poroshenko or Yulia or others. But at the end of the day, suddenly, especially after the popular singer Vakarchuk decided not to run for whatever reasons, and that's also intriguing, why he didn't run. Suddenly, he is not only doing well, but he's the front runner by far. And remember that for most of last year, it was Yulia Tymoshenko that was in the lead, and Poroshenko was fighting for his political life. He was fighting to get into that second place, and suddenly Yulia is displaced, and she is in third place. Poroshenko sneaks in, but he's still massively behind. And I think what has changed is that neither Poroshenko nor Yulia nor Hrytsenko, nor anybody else, none of us, expected that Zelensky would emerge as the clear favorite and would achieve such massive, well, let's say, support. I would say the credit that he's being given, as I said before, not even knowing what it is that concretely he is proposing. So we're in a very strange situation. We haven't encountered this sort of thing in the 27, 28 years of Ukraine's independence. On the one hand, it's a victory for democracy. It's a victory for pluralism. On the other hand, there are great risks. But at the end of the day, the population is voting through the ballot box. It wants to make a very clear change and break with what there has been for the last 5 years. And the real questions are why? Why has Poroshenko allowed the situation to develop to such a stage that he gets, barely 16, 17% of the votes, and an unknown character, until recently dismissed as a clown, does so well? And why does this unknown quantity defeat people like Tymoshenko, like Hrytsenko, like all the others that are running? I think there are many people who are just giving him the benefit of the doubt, saying, look, we just don't want to continue in this limbo, and others who are saying, no, give him a chance, he will deliver. He has promised that he's only running for 5 years. He's saying that he wants to open up the system. He wants to change habits. He wants to change the way things are done in Ukraine. So what he's doing at the moment, very skillfully through a handful of advisors, is projecting himself as somebody who is not seeking to just change faces at the top, but to change the way the system functions. That is, to return to the unfinished business started by the Maidan and the Revolution of Dignity of transforming the country, of opening it up, of making these democratic changes to the institutions, but also, I think, and this is where he is interesting, to change mindsets, to say that business cannot be done. It's not just the oligarchs, it's not Kolomoisky, Akhmetov, Firtash and the others that are to blame. It's in our own mindset. We want to have uncorrupt leaders, but we rely on corruption to cut corners, to get deals, to travel abroad, whatever it is. It starts with every one of us, and let's begin, and let's all be that character that he plays, a crusading reformer. Remember, this Servant of the People, the program that has been going for 3 years, it is a political parody. It's not a thriller. It's not a soap. It is a parody. And a lot of his critics are taking this and his mockery of the way the system functions, and within it, Ukrainian elements, as his real position. But having watched it, I disagree with respected colleagues and friends like Alex Motyl and others. I don't take it at face value. I don't feel that he's just been making a mockery of all things Ukrainian. First and foremost, as a businessman, his series, Servant of the People, was pitched to a Russian-speaking audience in the CIS countries. To sell that product, they wanted to sell it not only in Russia, but in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, whatever, to make money. And he has made money. He became a millionaire. So he avoided purposefully dealing with Russia in the program. Is that a minus or a plus? For us, I guess patriotically inclined Ukrainians, it's a minus, because how can you deal with realities of today without mentioning Russia and the war? But again, if you're a businessman and you want to be selling your product, you stay clear of that. On the other hand, his program, which has a great deal of appeal, it has had its very positive, I would say, side, other than the drawbacks that I've mentioned, in the sense that it's helped to raise awareness about political issues, about corruption, about our mindsets, about how Ukrainians function or dysfunction. And at the end of the day, it's one of the very few examples of a kind of public education. Now, obviously, critics are saying, but it's slanted. It's slanted towards the East. It's slanted towards Russia. When I look at it, I think that in any democracy, in any pluralistic system, there is room for that type of program. Why haven't the opposition, let's say, why hasn't the president, who has resources and has Channel 5, why didn't he subsidize a program of his own that would offer maybe a satirical view of Ukraine, but giving the pitch from the other direction? So we can't just blame him for doing that. Secondly, I think the value of that program, other than raising awareness, is that it was pitched primarily to Russian speakers and to the South and the East. The positive thing is that it's raised awareness about corruption and other problems within Ukrainian society, but at the same time, this Russian-speaking character called Holoborodko actually ends up uniting Ukraine and fighting corruption and rebuilding confidence in a Ukrainian state. Yes, it's done through the use of satire, and there is one element that, for example, my friend Olis Motel and others have pointed to, where an extreme ultra-right Ukrainian group take power for about 5 or 10 minutes of one of the programs. But I tell you, living in Kiev, when you see some of the ultra-right groups here walking around, not just with torches, but in their uniforms, I wouldn't like to be a dissident here or to have a different viewpoint about Ukraine with characters like this, who I would believe wouldn't discuss with me, but would crack my skull open. So I think that's fair. And it's unfair to take that depiction of that type of Ukrainian, which to me is very unpleasant and is not the kind of Ukrainian that fits into my value scheme. I think that it's unfair to take that presentation out of context. So if we look at it all, I think he's raised awareness, not only in Ukraine generally, but within the semi-alienated south and east of Ukraine. What he's done is made them feel part of this community. He's taken votes. At the end of the day, he has taken votes away from the pro-Russian forces. If he wasn't around in this election, Boyko and the others from the former Regions Party would have got substantially more. So is that good or bad? I think that's very good for the unity of the country. And when you ask the question about, the division of voting, he's had a more unified showing of support in the country than any of the other voters. He's won in almost all of the oblasts and all of the regions, including the center, apart from the 3 to the west, and apart from the 2 to the very east of the country, where Boyko and the Regions Party won, Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, the other thing that is often forgotten, and I hear this from my Russian friends, a factor that we don't take into account. Many Russians watch in Russia and in Kazakhstan also, watch this Servant of the People, and they come back to me or to my friends and they say, by God, if they can show these kinds of programs and you can be so critical of your system and of your president or whatever, that is light years ahead of what we have here in Russia or in Belarus or in other countries. So don't forget that there is that other hidden value in the program. Don't see it all as negative. Now, I don't want to sound as his advocate, but I'm saying there's more to the character, and there are more pluses than simply all minuses. Now, what I also think strongly, and I've expressed this in several articles for the Kiev Post and the Asia Times or whatever, where I try to argue in a balanced way rather than on my Facebook, where I'm much more subjective because that's my own page. What I think is that we have to take into account is that Zelensky, whether we like it or not, he represents an achievement of the post-Maidan and the revolution of dignity in the sense that he is a representative of the new burgeoning political nation. And that political nation is not simply obsessed, not in any negative sense. It's not preoccupied with the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian historical and cultural traditions. It is about the formation of a entity called the Ukrainian political nation, loyal to the state, loyal to the territory, prepared to fight against the Russians and uphold those positions, and who's, I think, among whom the notion of the primacy of Ukrainian cultural values and language and narrative in history is not challenged, but they are resentful or wary of this Ukrainian content being projected too strongly. Zelensky said recently in an interview, I found that was very interesting, when he was asked about the Ukrainian language, he said, look, I'm more comfortable speaking in Russian. I grew up in Kryvyi Rih. I made my career in Dnipro. But look at my children. They go to schools where Ukrainian is taught. They're very comfortable in the Ukrainian language. And of course, that is the road to the future. We will all be speaking Ukrainian sooner or later. And the younger generation is already, even in Eastern Ukraine, very comfortable with Ukrainian, not just in universities, but in primary schools and whatever. So the message is there. Keep the Ukrainization gradual, and we'll get there eventually, as opposed to making it more, shall we say, accelerated, where you risk alienating or making people in the South and the East feel uncomfortable. And the real issue here is that Ukrainians, and maybe even the majority, let's be frank, of those not only who are bilingual, but who prefer to speak by inertia in Russian, because that's how they grew up. And just as many of us, when we meet, we speak in English, it doesn't make us less Ukrainian. It's easier for us, which is easy. We have the terminology, vocabulary, or whatever. But I think there is this complex in Eastern and Southern Ukraine that lingers on, that somehow the center, Kyiv, and the West treats them or looks at them explicitly or implicitly as second-rate Ukrainians, that because they aren't Ukrainian speakers, that they somehow are not up to par, they're not up to speed as Ukrainians. And their argument, when you talk to them, and there are very many of them here in Kyiv, especially, since the war started, 1.5 million IDPs, who'll tell you, look, I'm a Russian speaker, I can speak to you in Ukrainian, I prefer to speak in Russian, but I've been at the front for 2 years, my son or my brother is there, they've died or whatever. So what we're at is at this very delicate stage of Project Ukraine, where I think we have to be very careful not to disrupt and destroy the unificatory efforts that have been linked with the Maidan, the war in the East, standing together, by playing too much on national or even nationalistic feeling. And my one criticism that I've made in public of Poroshenko's policies in certainly the last 6 months or so, is that as the elections approached, he overplayed the nationalistic card. Thomas was great. Thomas was very important for all of us. But why didn't you start this 4 or 5 years ago, right? The language issue. Why bring in a bill into Parliament on the very eve of the elections, knowing it's divisive? Why didn't you start this 3 or 4 years ago? Again, the question. So what I'm saying is that there's political manipulation for personal political ends, which are not necessarily in the interests of the country. As patriots, we want to see these results. We want to see a bolstering of the status of Ukrainian. We want to see, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church fully independent from Moscow. But the timing is suspect, given the political calculations that were made. But given also the background of all the dirt, that alleged dirt that has come out, not only about embezzlement from the Ministry of Defense, procurements in the defense sector, but many other scandals that are pending, that has made it seem to many in the electorate that the president has been rather cynical about his approach to Ukrainian values. And I think what has been also disturbing, and this I've been mentioning this more recently, and I think this might offend some people to hear, but I want to be frank, and I mean it in the spirit of being constructive and stimulating discussion, is that some of our key representatives of the Ukrainian cultural intelligentsia and religious leaders, instead of staying above the fray and exuding their wisdom as moral authorities, they've been brought in, like in the old Soviet times in the last few weeks, to all, back the president and to present, to repeat his mantra that without me, Ukraine will collapse, Ukraine will not exist. Now, what about tomorrow? What if Zelensky wins? Who's he going to talk to? If you demonize the guy and he wins an overwhelming majority, what signal is that sending? How do you build unity and how do we move forward? And for example, the religious leaders, whether the heads of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Greek Catholic Church, but even the evangelicals with whom Poroshenko has been working very hard in the last 2 or 3 weeks to get votes, all of them are saying that basically the key issue is either you love Ukraine or you don't love Ukraine. That is what the vote is about. But from religious leaders, Christians, I would expect them to mention the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal, mention something about corruption. Patriotism is fine, but is that your job in a society where the church and state are theoretically separate? So there are a lot of questions here. And the bottom line, I'm sorry to go on and make this into a monologue, but I think the bottom line is that there's much more to this election than meets the eye. It's not just Poroshenko, Zelensky. It's not just what we know and what we don't know. I would venture to say that we're at another defining moment in our history where we are, in a sense, it's a test about our political maturity as a people, the quality of our democracy, and most importantly, the quality of our values. To be Ukrainian and to steal is okay if you speak Ukrainian, but if you challenge this and you speak Russian, this is somehow bad. What are we about at this stage? Remember, there was a writer still alive, Yavorylsky, who asked, I think at the end of the 80s when the Ruch was being formed, Что мы за народ? What kind of people are we? Posing that rhetoric. And that question comes back. What are we about, Ukrainians? We want to move to Europe. We want to be European in our values. We want to be open and democrats. And yet. So I think, especially for the younger generation, sophisticated in the sense that they are at home with social media, they travel. Many of them now speak several languages or one language. They have experience of being abroad. They are not going to buy what the older generation bought before us. And therefore, we're at this very delicate moment, which I call the clash of the old and the new. And whether Zelensky is actually as genuine as I'm suggesting he should be, given the way he's projecting himself, but I have no guarantees about that, and whether he can actually deliver getting the right team together and getting the apparat to function, and more importantly, winning enough votes and getting a coalition behind him in Parliament in October, November, remains to be seen. But again, another bottom line, another key factor is that whatever happens, unless they really make some big mistakes, is that if he comes to the helm, even though he will be a lame duck president, or even Poroshenko, if he wins, will be a lame duck president until we know what reconfiguration of politics and political life there will be and what results it will bring. Will there be an efficient and credible parliament in October and November? If not, more of the bolota, the mud, the quagmire that we've been in. But the fact that there is a new broom, a new face, it suggests that there may be a new window of opportunity, because obviously there will be horse dealing, there will be trade-offs as new coalitions are formed. Some of the old parties are falling to bits, not only Narodny Front, but Samopomich, others. The president's party, if he loses, will be reduced to a rump. So in that situation, one hopes that not only will the new constellation consist of the old forces, just sort of old wine in new bottles, right? But that there will be other factors appearing. Let me give you an example. Last Saturday, I was at a big meeting of a new party that's about to be launched in May. That's the Liberals. I think they will call themselves the Liberals. They're calling themselves People Matter at the moment. This is basically a group of Kyiv deputies who broke off from Samopomich, highly professional businessmen, lawyers, etc., who are creating this new, modern, sophisticated, professional party with an ideology, with a liberal, right liberal, as opposed to left. And there are various other initiatives going on. So hopefully some of these forces will actually coalesce and reappear. I think a lot of people are simply waiting to see what the final result will be. And at that point, when we know the results and we know who is actually abandoning the old forces, because clearly, not just rats leave a sinking ship, but even more opportunistically inclined, or even the disaffected ones, I think we will see from those nuclei of these variants that appear, the emergence of new parties. So it won't simply be, Tymoshenko, Lyashko, if he even gets in. One other thing that was very interesting today, apart from the fact that polls are now suggesting that Zelensky is as much as 47% ahead, which is incredible to believe, 47%. Well, even if he wins with 15 or 20%, that would be a huge and convincing margin. But there was also, the polls were suggesting what would happen if there was a precipitated vote for the parliament. And that again showed that some of the veteran forces on the scene have been blown out of the water and won't exist there anymore. Opening the way, as I say, to new possibilities. So, to sum up here, the election is fraught with the unknown and risks, but it also opens new opportunities and challenges, and it depends, on how Zelensky's people approach this, but how society reacts. How civil society reacts, how the other parties that voted against Poroshenko react. Will they lend a helping hand, or will they remain selfish and just look after their own, partisan interests and whatever? So we live in exciting times. When I was interviewing Diane Francis, I think known in Canada as an eminent North American journalist here, a year or two ago, she said, Bogdan, don't assume that corruption is in the DNA of Ukrainians. She said, I come from Chicago. Do you remember what Chicago was like in the 60s under Mayor Daley? She said, my father had to pay at least 2 bribes a day to get to work in his car. And that was just recent. Or she said, what about the Rockefellers and the oil industry? We had our oligarchs, but we managed to tame them, not by destroying them, but by, putting the oligarchs in their place in some reasonable way where they were also useful for society and could use their wealth to generate more wealth, but also contribute to the development of that society. And that's what we have to find. And, you know, if they are clever and if they are resourceful, let them generate that wealth. But that wealth has to be distributed and it cannot be monopolized. That, I think, is the message. Look, I was at this meeting of the Liberals that I told you about, very interesting, on Saturday. And one of the presentations, just to ram home how far we lag behind and how much time we've lost, even in the last 5 years. One of the presenters, an economist, said, here is a figure, 61. And there were 1,000, well, I don't know, 750, 1,000 people in the hall. And he said, and can anybody tell me what does 61 have to do with the state of Ukraine's economy? And he said, well, let me tell you, 61 hours, in 61 hours, Germany produces the NDP that Ukraine does in a year. Put that in perspective, 61 hours, that's Ukraine. And then he said, it was going to take us at this present rate of 2.53%, if we're lucky, of economic growth. It's going to take us 50 years to catch up to Poland, never mind anybody else. And then some of the economic experts that were there, former ministers and whatever, were saying, we have to reach within 3 or 4 years a minimum of 10% growth rate, which means attracting the investment, you know, putting the oligarchs in their place, but not destroying them, you know, using them effectively, etc., etc. That's the challenge. But remember, at the end of the day, also, we are in a situation that we need the economic growth, we need investment. But even this year, Ukraine has to pay back, what is it, 36, 35, 37%, I've forgotten the exact figure, but somewhere in that range of our GDP in terms of foreign debt, and even more next year. That is crippling. You see, we've been taking loans at 10% interest. Which other country can afford to do that? And yet that has been done. That has bailed us out. So we've been living on a false economy. We've been propped up. Okay, the positive thing is that they're no longer printing money and subsidizing the economy that way. The National Bank is under control, whatever. But at the same time, it's a false dichotomy because we've borrowed so much from the World Bank, the IMF, and whatever. These guys, even if they lose and go away, some of them hopefully will be brought to trial or if the courts are changed, because bringing them to trial now is not going to do anything. But at the end of the day, it's it's the young generation and the ones after that have to foot the bill for the. It's not just the incompetence, but let's say the political exploitation that has occurred in recent years, and in years when we've got rid of Yanukovych and supposedly cleaned the house. And that is what this election is also about. And great talking to you. Thanks for having me. All the best. Cheers. Bye.